Good morning. Today's daf is daf Lamed Base 32. We're at the bottom of Lamed Aleph Amid Base 31b, the second wide line. The Mishnah has spoken about people that cannot transfer the Eruv and set it up for the person themselves because they are not of mind that they can have the intent when they set up the Eruv to do it for the person setting up the meal. So I want to send the meal out to 2,000 alma outside the city to set up my Shabbos space so that I can walk for a mitzvah 2,000 alma beyond that. And I send it with a child, or I send it with a deaf mute, or a shota, someone who is not cognitively able, and I send it that way. So the Mishnah says it's not going to be a good Eruv. However, the Mishnah says if I have arranged with someone else to receive that Eruv where I send it, and they set it up for me, that's going to be fine. So I'm coming into town, and I see that 2,000 amma outside. There are some people camping. They set up their camp. This is their Shabbos space, and I say, hey, wait, I also want to join you, but I don't have a meal. I'm going to go into town, I'm going to send it with someone, and you receive it and put it down for me, and you make the Eruv for me. So we can assume that they will have done that. Maybe the child is not actually going to bring it to this person. So how can it work? Where he has a clear vision, he can see it's not hilly out there, and there are no fires, so you can see distant. And he can see that the child walked to where the encampment is. Fine. So wherever Rabbi Chisda said that, so too over here, that's what's going on. Maybe the person he had arranged to receive that and put it down, put the food down as his Eruv, he will not do it, will not receive it. As Rabbi Chiel said, we have a general rule. We can assume that when you give someone a mission, a shalichus, you make them your proxy, you make them your shaliach, your messenger, that they will do what they accepted to do on your behalf. So if Rabbi Chiel said it there, so too over here, you can assume the person will do it and accept his shlichus. If he accepts his shlichus, that he will fulfill it. Which statement that Rav Chisda Rabbi Chiel, we said, just as he said over there, so too it will apply over here. Where did they say that? We said about this. The time we learned. If you train your barnum and bailey, and you train an elephant to bring the Eruv and put it down somewhere, or an ape of some sort, Ein ze Eruv. That doesn't count as an Eruv. However, if you gave it to the elephant and had the elephant bring it to someone else who you had prearranged to receive it, it is a good Eruv. So Gemara says, well, maybe the elephant never brought it there. He watches the elephant walk there and give it. Maybe the person you arranged to receive it and set up the Eruv is not going to do so. So we can assume you arrange with someone to be a shaliach, to be your power of attorney, and then they will do it, and they will make the shlichus, they will make the Eruv on your behalf as the shlichus they have accepted.
I think we have a chazaka, an elephant never forgets also.
We have a what?
A chazaka, an elephant never forgets.
Yes. But we don't know that it never doesn't deliver. It could miss a delivery. Amar Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman says it's true. You can assume and rely upon the chazaka. You can rely upon that if you set up a proxy, you set up a shaliach, that shaliach will do it on your behalf. However, that's only in a rabbinic obligation. But in a Torah obligation, a Torah prohibition, a B'shel Torah, you cannot assume that. You have to know that it was done. And so over here, we'll see later, there's a machlokas of whether the concept of walking out of the city beyond a certain limit is a Torah prohibition or rabbinic prohibition. But everybody agrees that the limit of 2,000 amma is rabbinic. That the Torah prohibition would be beyond that. And 2,000 amma is a rabbinic prohibition. And so making an Eruv at 2,000 amma is a rabbinic concept. And so even if the person missed it, and yes, it's true that we can generally rely on someone accepting to do their mission that they will do it. But we know that not always is that truth. Not always does it happen. And so as long as it's not a Torah prohibition that would come of it, so you can rely on it because you tried to do it correctly. And if in the end it turns out that they didn't do it, so you've transgressed the rabbinic prohibition, but not a Torah prohibition, and the rabbinic prohibition itself is offense. So you don't have to make offense to offense. But B'Shel Sofrim, but B'Shel Torah, if it was a Torah prohibition, then it would be prohibition prohibited. It would not be sufficient to rely on a shaliach. B'Shel Sofrim. Now we go to Lamed Beis Amud Aleph. B'Shel Sofrim Chazaka Shliach Haseh Shechusa. However, by rabbinic obligations, then you can rely on the Chazaka of the Shliach. Rav Shesha says no. You can always rely on a shaliach, even in a Torah obligation. We can assume it was done and we're going to prove it. Amar Rav Shesha Rav Shesha says, how do I know this? The Tanan we learned. We know that you're not allowed to eat grain of that grows this year, mostly this year, unless the Omer has already been brought. So the second morning of Pesach. So in the morning of Pesach, what they would do is they would gather some of the barley, and that bring the Omer offering from that barley, and then all the grains of that year that had been harvested from the previous year are allowed to be eaten. That's the concept of Chadash and Yashan, Omer. Now, some people would know when that happened, but others wouldn't know because they live too far. So how do they know when they can eat it? So we learned in the Mishnah, as soon as the Omer was brought as an offering, the new grains are permissible immediately. However, those that are far can eat it from midday already, because you can assume this is a Torah obligation. They will have it done by noon, because Chazaka, Shliach Shechusa, the Kohanim are our power of attorney in this mitzvah. They are the ones that are our Shliach. They do it on our behalf, and we can assume that they will do it. So you see, even though there is a Torah prohibition to eat those grains before the Omer is brought, you can assume it was done by midday. Chadash is a Torah prohibition. And we say that they can bring it from midday, they can eat from midday. Isn't it on account of that the shaliach we can assume the shaliach has done what his obligation is, what he accepted to do, and therefore you can eat it. And so too, we see, even by a Torah obligation, shliach haseh. Rav Nachman says no. There's a separate reason. There, because we know, based in, meaning the communal obligation, will be done correctly. They won't be lazy about it. They'll do it early in the day and they'll get it done. And by midday, for sure, it's done. But generally, when you have an individual shaliach, no such proof, no such, you can't just rely on it. Some say actually the conversation went the reverse, where Rav Nachman was the one that used this as proof to himself. He said, look, only based in, but not an individual. Some say Rav Nachman.
I think we should ask Rick whether he backs it up or not.
Whether what?
Whether Rick backs this up or not.
That what?
That Basedin is not lazy about taking on these cases.
Taking on what?
That Basedin. It says the Basedin is not going to be lazy about it. So we should check with Rick, make sure That's a good assumption or not. Rick having been.
It may be that current governments are different.
Could be.
Yeah. How do I know that this is true, that you cannot rely in a Torah obligation on a shliach doing his obligation, that you can only rely on shliach shechuse, that a shliach will do his obligation when we're dealing with a rabbinic obligation? Because look at this, because we learned that the reason you can rely on the Kohanim and the Beis Din having done the Omer, and therefore everybody can eat their grain by midday, is only because Beis Din will not be lazy. Beis Din being the communal representatives, the Kohanim and the communal representatives doing the Omer will for sure do it by midday. So Beis Din will do Lemisatzlim, because it's a communal obligation. There's a lot of people doing it. We know for sure it will get done. Hashaliach, Misatzah, but if you had an individual shaliach to do your mitzvah, to do your obligation, we cannot rely on that and know that it was done if it's a Torah obligation. And Rav Shesha says, no, Beis Din is unique in that we can assume it was done by midday already. But by the end of the day, for sure, by the deadline of when it's supposed to be done, you know for sure that a shliach would do it for you. You can rely on that. Rav Shesha's manami nila. So Rav Shesha says, I have another way that I can prove this to you. The Tani we learned, a postpartum woman who's bringing her two-bird carbon, or a zava who's post-ziva bringing her two-bird carbon. So she brings coins and puts it into a chest, a basket, or whatever it is, some deposit box at the Beis HaMikdash. V'tovelas, and she'll go to the mikveh. And that evening she can eat kachim, because she can know for sure that the Kahanim brought her carbon that day. My time, what's the reason? The Kahanim are acting as our shaliach in the Beis HaMikdash to do the carbon, and we can assume that the shaliach did his bidding. Rav Nachman, to which Rav Nachman says, no, Hasam Kedar Shammai. There, the reasoning is like Rav Shammai. The Amar of Shammai, Rav Shammai said, Chazaka im Beis Din shel Kahanim oimdim misham achich l'kol Moshe b'shofar. The Chazaka is that the Kahanim in the Beis HaMikdash will not leave for the day. They will not end their avodah in the day unless they check and make sure that their entire chest that women put in the money for the birds is completely empty, and all the birds that need to be brought are brought. And so that's why she can go to the mikveh and she can eat kachim that evening, on account of they know that the Kahanim Beis Din would have done it for sure. Amar Rav Sheshes. So Rav Sheshes further says, where can I prove this from? The Tana we learned. Somebody says to a fellow, go harvest some figs for me from my fig trees. Now, we're going to encounter a couple of ideas in Teruma. One idea is that somebody out in the field, before they've gathered a proper amount of harvest, can eat achilas arai. They can eat, even though it has not been tithed, nobody's taken truma, they can eat a non-proper sit-down. They can just nibble on, so while they're harvesting, they can nibble on some produce. That's called achilas arai. The another idea is that demai, which we saw earlier, which is when you don't know whether someone took tithes or not, or whether it's been taken, so you have to take more teruma or maser on account of that you don't know who's taken. Another halacha, the concept of termin min amukaf, that the proper way of taking teruma is having all the produce there and then taking teruma, but not saying, look, I got some in out of my field there, and I have some out in my field there, and I have a bit of produce here, and I'm going to take truma or maaser from it over here and exempt the produce over there, which may not be known to people. And what problem can happen? Somebody out there can take teruma from that produce, but that produce has already been tithed. And so it's no longer applicable, and the teruma will not work because that's already fixed and tithed produce. So that's called shalom min amukaf, not in its surrounding and not surrounded together, not where the produce is not together, and that's not a good thing to do. Another halacha is that, or a chazaka, that we can assume that someone who is careful with halacha, a chaver, would not motzi mitachas yadei davar she'eino mesuken, would not allow something to leave his possession if it isn't fixed, if it is not already tithed and ready to be eaten by others, because he doesn't want to give produce to someone else where they are perhaps won't know that it's not tithed. They would assume, oh, so and so had this. It comes from so and so. Must be that it's already teruma's taken, a maaser's taken. It's all ready to go, and then in the end they're causing them a stumbling block where they're going to eat this produce under the false assumption that it's already been tithed. And so there's a chazaka that the chaver would not allow something to leave his property, or leave his possession untied. And this is going to come to a point of friction, because if you have produce out in the field, you would have to take teruma shalom and amukaf from a distance in order to make sure that that people not receive produce that's untied. On the other hand, that itself is a problem. So we have the one chazaka, the one assumption that a chacham, a chaver would only take teruma when it's in one area, when it's together. On the other hand, he won't allow it to leave his property unless it's already tied, and he's not there. So he's going to have to do it from a distance. So which one would they prefer is going to be a point of friction, a point of two chazakas that are going to contradict each other. But the first part is we're going to have to assume that it became obligated in teruma. And the obligation in teruma is going to have to happen through the shaliach, through someone telling someone else, go out there and harvest some produce for me, which would obligate it in teruma. And now we're going to have to assume, did he or did he not tithe at home to exempt this? So we have a brisa like this. Somebody says to his friend, go out to my fields, to my fig orchard, and harvest some figs for me. Bring me back some figs. All right, so he's allowed to eat them as is, just to nibble on them without actually sitting down and because they were not obligated in mas. And when he does have enough, he tithes it as an absolutely obligated item. In other words, he does not assume that the owner back home would have taken any tithe from it. Well, why not? Because he can't know how much he harvested, because he didn't give him a measure. He just said, go harvest some for me. Maybe he took 5 pounds, maybe he took 50 pounds. So he can't tithe it back home because he doesn't even know how much. However, if he said, Malay lecha kalazu, if he says, bring this basket full of produce back to me, figs from my fig tree, he's allowed to eat and without it becoming obligated yet. But when he's obligated in the tithe, in other words, he fills the basket and he now has a produce pile, then he has to tithe it, but as demai, as something that may have already been tithed and he doesn't know. When do we say this in regards to an Amma Aretz? We say this in regards to someone who we're not sure they would tithe themselves. But by a chaver, if the fellow is someone who's strict in halacha, you can assume that he tithed it, and you don't have to tithe it at all. Divrei Rebbe. That's the opinion of Rebbe. However, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, when do we say this? This is by an Am Haaretz, by someone who you can't be sure whether or not they tithe it, and therefore you tithe it as a demai, as something that may or may not need tithing. But if the owner was someone who is strict in halacha, then you have to, on a Torah level, tithe this, because you can be sure he would not have tithed it. As we said, because we would not assume that a chaver would tithe something that isn't present around him. They would have to do a long distance tithing. We assume a chaver doesn't do it, so you can be sure that he has not yet tithed it, and you would tithe it properly. So we have Rebbe arguing with his father, Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi. He says, no, we can assume he's tithed it for sure, because he would not, as we'll see, because he does not want his produce out of his hands untithed. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, his father, says, no, we can assume he for sure did not tithe it, because he would not tithe it until it's all together. Amar Rebbe Nirin Devarei Midivrei Abba. And Rebbe says, I think I'm correct in this argument with my father, because because we would rather assume that a chaver, someone strict in halacha, is going to tithe it even at long distance, which is not the best way to do it, but nevertheless he will do so. Why? Because he wants to make sure that other people are not going to be eating under his watch, under his responsibility. Other people are not going to be eating untithed produce. So that's the end of that brisa. So Gemara now analyze. Their only argument is, did he take tithes from long distance? The owner, did he tithe it or not? But what for sure everybody would agree that the assumption is that the shaliach harvested what he was told to harvest and what he agreed to harvest, regardless. And now the only question is, did he or did he not tithe it? But if the shaliach would never have done his work yet, so then for sure the tithing would be invalid, because even if he tithed back home and said, oh, the shaliach has filled a basket, I'm going to now take 10% of that over here and redeem it and exempt that basket out there, how do you know he even did it? Must be, you see that both the Rebbe and Rosh Shimon Gamliel are assuming the shaliach did what he had accepted to be done. He went out and he harvested a basket full of figs. And the only question is, is this already tithed from the owner back home, or is it not? So Rav Shesha says, you see, this is a Torah obligation, and a question of a Torah obligation being fulfilled or not, and a Torah prohibition being in place if it's not filled, and yet we're relying on the fact that the shaliach did what he said he would do. Rav Nachman explains, Hasam Kedetar Rav Chanina Chuzai. The Amar Rav Chanina Chuzai said, Chazaku al Chaver Sheinu Maitzim Davar Sheinu Masukim Etachas Yada. It's not on account of the Chazaka, the Shaliach did his part, but rather because he wouldn't allow his produce outside of his possessions, because he wants to make sure no one's going to eat under his watch, under his responsibility, and since these are his produce, his fruit, he has to make sure that he tithes it before it leaves his possession, before somebody else eats from it. So must be that when we're talking about that he's constantly tithing, or he's tithing in a way that for sure, when he knows for sure, will be done, in order that he doesn't cause a stumbling block where other people have his produce that's untithed. But in general, to say that we assume the shaliach is going to do what he needs to do, perhaps not, because indeed it is possible that shliach will be lazy and not complete the work he needs to be done. Amar ma. So the teacher had said, and we're going to analyze this. Rebbe said, if he, and not telling us who he's referring to as he, is a chaver, someone who's strict in halacha, well then we know for sure that it's already been tied. Hi amaretz the ka'amar le'laman. In the first case, he said, however, if he's not strict in halacha, if he's in amaretz, well then we cannot assume that it was tied. Who did he make his shaliach? Who did he say go out to the field and receive and harvest some of this produce? Did he say to another Amma Aretz like him, someone who also is not so strict in halacha, and said, hey, go out and harvest some of my field? Well, what are we going to tell him? He's an Amma Aretz. You can't rely on him to harvest, so to have taken a tithe, so you have to tithe. He's going to say, why? I'm in the same status, and I feel like I could rely on it. Is he gonna listen to that? He himself is not so strict in halacha, and he says, look, I'm sure he tithe. Why would I have to tithe again? So it must be that the farmer, the owner of the field, is an Amma Aretz and not so strict in halacha. And the person going out into the field to harvest on his behalf is a chaver, someone who's strict in halacha. And we're telling him, tithe, just in case the homeowner didn't. The kamalei lechaver ema sefer. Well, then what's in the next case? Nirin divrei devarim divrei abba. To which he said, you know what? I think my halacha is correct over my father because mutav sheyachshedu chaverim literal shalem and amukaf, because we would rather that assume that the chaver, the homeowner who's strict in halacha, who's a chaver, is going to tithe even shalem and amukav, even though that it's not in the optimum way. It's not where he has it, where it's all together. And he says, so as not to have an Amma Aretz, not to have someone who's not strict in halacha eat produce, which now Rebbe is identifying the shaliach, the messenger who's harvesting, as someone who's not strict in halacha. So what's going on? In the first case, we said that the homeowner is the Amma Aretz, and the shaliach is the chaver, is strict in halacha. And now we're saying that the homeowner is the strict in halacha, and the shaliach is someone who's an Amma Aretz, and that's why he's going to tithe it, because he's not sure that that the shaliach, the field worker, is the one that's going to tithe, and so he's going to tithe it even though it's not in an optimum way, because he's tithing it when it's not together. So Amma Aretz, my boy, awesome. What changed? Why are we assuming that the shaliach, the messenger, is an Amma Aretz? Amar Ravina, so Ravina says the ratio of Amma Aretz Shamal Chaver, Sefer B'Chaver Shamal Amma Aretz. Indeed, in each case, you have one person who's strict and one is not. And so in the first case, where the person who's sending is not strict, so we're giving a scenario where if the shaliach is strict, so he should make sure to tithe on his own. In the second case, where the shaliach, the sender, the meshaleach, the homeowner, is the one that's being that is strict in halacha, he's a chaver. So therefore, we're saying in a scenario where the shaliach is not, so then the homeowner is going to take the tithe, even, Rebbe says, the homeowner is going to take a tithe even from a distance, which is not the correct way, not the optimal way of doing it, in order to save the fellow from eating untithed produce. And so how does he even know about this? B'chaver achar shama. So what's going on? Sefer b'chaver shama al-amaretz, b'chaver achar shama. There's another chaver, another person who is strict in halacha, who hears this conversation of him going out there to harvest. So now the Amma Aretz himself for sure can eat it, But the idea is that even another chaver, even someone else who's strict, is allowed to rely on it and eat it, and he can assume that it's already been harvested, even when this guy comes back, because he's savar. And now we turn to Lamed Beis, 32b, because we can rely upon the homeowner having tithed it for the Am Haaretz, for the fellow who's not so strict on halacha, so much so that even when he brings it back into town, and another chaver, someone else who's strict in halacha, will be able to rely and say, indeed, this is already tithed produce. Savar Isa chaver, the other chaver, the other person strict in halacha who sees this produce is going to say, for sure, I can eat from it as well. I can eat, and I don't have to tithe. Because the homeowner for sure will have tithed it. The first chaver, the first person strict in halacha. Why? He tithed from a distance, because, as he's going to say, because he wants to make sure that it's been eaten, and he'd rather take some responsibility of doing something not perfect in order to save other people from making a mistake. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says no. The second chaver should not eat, because of course the Am Haaretz may not listen to us, but the chaver who's strict in halacha, he also should. Just a friend of his should not eat, because we assume that he may not have tithed it. He would not have tithed it, and therefore he needs to tithe himself. Because we assume that a chaver, someone who's strict in halacha, would not tithe when all the produce isn't right there. To which Rebbe said, no. But it's better for a person to harvest, to tithe when he's not at the harvest, tithe from wherever he is, even at a distance. And why? So as not to cause someone who's not strict in halacha to eat that which is untithed. So we see that it is better to do something imperfect, according to Rebbe, rather than causing someone else to transgress. And this is the thing from at the beginning of Shabbos, where at the beginning of Shabbos we saw the question of somebody who had put bread into the oven, and somebody else wants to come and take that out, which is a rabbinic prohibition. Should he not transgress a rabbinic prohibition to save someone else, a Torah prohibition? And there the Gemara says that there's a concept. We don't say chatei, we don't say sin in order to help someone else. Tosfos here makes multiple distinctions between our case and over there. Here it's just a less. It's not the best and optimal way of doing it, but it's not a prohibition. There's a prohibition. That could be one distinction. Another distinction says, no, they're both prohibitions, but over there, the person was negligent in his action. Here, this is entirely the homeowner's obligation. It's not the obligation of the shaliach to begin with, so he must make sure that it's done. Either way, there is a distinction. But Rebbe is saying a concept here that it is better for the chaver to take the teruma, to take the maser from a distance, even though he's not min hamukav, in order to make sure that people are not eating untithed produce.
When would we say, or when could we say, in a situation like this, for instance, well, you'd hope that the second chaver who's observing all of this knows this din, figures out what's going on here, and there's no chashad at all. The second chaver could have said, I know that Mishnah, I know that Brisa, and I see the Am Haaretz there, and I see the chaver there. Okay, so that's probably what's going on. Why does there have to be? Why do we have to come out to a chashad at all? If this being the case, that it's better not to give the Am Haaretz tevel to eat. So okay, so that's what he did. It's what he had to do.
I'm not sure. You're talking about Rebbe, or you're talking about Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel?
I'm just saying in general. They knew that you would hope that he's a chaver. He knows the halacha.
Well, there's two opinions here. That's the idea. We have the Mr. Chaver A owns a field with a bunch of figs. He sends someone out who's not so strict in halacha, so in Am Haaretz. He sends him out, please harvest some. He now has a quandary. On the one hand, he wants to make sure that no one's eating his produce untithed. On the other hand, he knows the halacha, the homeowner knows the halacha, that he's not supposed to tithe unless all the produce is there. If he waits that long, someone may eat some from his produce untithed. So what should he do? So Rebbe says it is better to do the less optimum way of tithing, as long as you're going to make sure no one's going to eat. And therefore, anybody else watching this can assume it's already tithed. That's opinion A, Rebbe. However, his father, Rav Shimon Gamliel, said, no, it is better to, you do your part, you do what you need to do, which is not tithe until it gets back to you. And you don't worry about anybody else eating untithed produce. That's your obligation, to wait until the produce comes back, and you're not going to tithe it. And so therefore, someone else who sees the produce coming in has to assume it's untithed. That's the machlokas between Rebbe and Rabbi Yehuda Anasi and his father, Rav Shimon Gamliel.
But the chad comes from the second chaver who's watching all this, right?
Correct, but the question is, what can he assume? Can he assume the homeowner has already tithed it, because even though that's not the correct way of doing it, but he will have done it to save anybody from eating this untithed? Or do we assume that he would not have done it because it's better not to do it? And so knowing the halacha is not going to help, because the halacha tells you there are two opinions what's better.
Well, he's not watching somebody eat over there.
He himself wants to eat.
He just sees produce. All he does
is eat some of the produce. He wants to eat some figs.
Now, if he had a suffix, then he would just take two mitzvahs and he wouldn't make a bracha. Is that what he would do?
Demai. That would be demai. Taking, if he's not sure whether it's been tithed, so he would take out of doubt. But Rebbe says no need for that. You can assume it's already tithed. He would never let this leave his possessions without tithing. So, so what's the machlokas based on? Rebbe said, it is better for a chaver to do a minor prohibition, and not be the source of someone else doing a larger, a greater prohibition. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, no, it is better for a person to take care of himself and make sure he does not do any prohibition, even a minor one, even if as a result, someone else is going to do a major prohibition. That's their choices, their issue. The Mishnah now is going to go into what happens if the Eruv is in a place that is outside of his accessibility. So the two different halachas that we're going to encounter here. Halacha number one is that the Eruv has to be in the place, in the same halachic domain that the person making Shabbos there is intending. So it can't be on a platform that's a Rishus HaYachid, a private domain, when he's intending to make Shabbos in a public domain. He's in the public domain, the Eruv is in a private domain, so the Eruv is not where he is. So that's issue number one. And issue number two is it has to be accessible, and there's a halacha that we've seen in Shabbos. You're not allowed to directly use a tree on Shabbos. We talked about this. So if you want to have a hammock that you can go on Shabbos, you're not allowed to tie the hammock directly to a tree branch, because if you do so, you're directly utilizing the tree and could break off a branch. Rather, what you have to do is you have to attach something to the tree and hang the hammock to that hook or to that rope that's attached to the tree. So it's a secondary, you're utilizing something that's attached to the tree, and that's permissible. So if your Eruv is on a tree branch, you have another issue, which is that it is not accessible because you're utilizing a tree on Shabbos. So you put this in a tree, you put the Eruv, whatever food you decided to have, let's say a loaf of bread, and you put it into a tree above 10 tefachim, ein Eruv Eruv. It's not going to be a good Eruv, and we're going to talk, this is talking about the tree itself is 4 tefachim wide, 10 tefachim high, so now it's defined as a private domain. You can't have the Eruv there. But if it's below 10 tefachim, it is a good Eruv, and the Gemara is going to challenge, hey, wait, how's he even taking that off? He's not allowed to touch a tree. Nasna babar, afilo amek mea ama eruv eruv. If he puts it into a pit, even if it's 100 amma deep, 150-foot deep pit, it's going to be a good eruv because he can go in there and spend Shabbos in there and be in the same domain as his eruv. Yosef Rav Chia bar Abba v'Rab Yosef v'Rav bar Nassim v'Yosef Rav Nachman Gabai. So these chachamim were sitting together. V'Yosef Kamrin, they were sitting and saying, "Hi ilan dekoi hecha." Where is this tree that we said there's a problem that it's above 10 tefachim high? Ilan dekoi b'shus hayachar is a tree in someone's private domain. It's enclosed within a fence. Mali lamala, mali lamatu. Who cares if it's above 10 tefachim, below 10 tefachim? He's in a private domain, and the food is in a private domain. Who cares if it's above 10 tefachim? It's all within a private domain. Rishus yachad oilad rakia. The private domain goes up to the heavens, meaning it's all within one space. Must be that the tree itself is in a public domain, so he would be standing in a public domain, and the eruv being on the tree is in a private domain. The mischaven lishvasecha, where is his intent to be for Shabbos? Ilema the mischaven lishvaslamala, is he intending to be on top of the tree in a tree house? So it's also good. He and the eruv are both within a private domain up in the tree. Must be that we're talking about that is intending to be below. He's going to be in the public domain, and the eruv is up in the tree. Fine. So we understand why you can't have it above 10 tefachim, but below 10 tefachim shouldn't work either, because he's in one place, because he cannot take the food off the tree because he's mishtamish be'ilan. V'aka mishtamish be'ilan. He's using a tree, and you're not allowed to use a tree on Shabbos. So we're going to have to say that it's in a public domain, and he intends to have Shabbos below in the street, and so therefore the eruv is out of reach. And what about him not utilizing the tree? So even below 10 tefachim, it should be invalid. The Rebbe, and this is the opinion of Rebbe. What is the prohibition of using a tree on Shabbos? It's not a Torah prohibition. The Torah prohibition is harvesting, breaking off a branch. It's a rabbinic fence. Don't use the tree because you may end up breaking off a branch to make it easier to get up and make it easier to get down. You may do so inadvertently. So this is a rabbinic prohibition called a shvus, a rabbinic Shabbos prohibition. That rabbinic prohibition only sets in, according to Rebbe, when it's for sure Shabbos. Bein hashmashas, at the twilight zone, where it's between Friday and Shabbos, the rabbinic prohibitions don't apply. For Rebbe, and the Amar called Davashu Mashvus Legazer Lebein Hashmashas. Anything that's a rabbinic prohibition, a shvus, the Chachamim did not enact it in the twilight zone, only when it's for sure Shabbos. What's the moment that you set your Shabbos Eruv? At Shkia, at sunset, at the point where Shabbos begins to set in even twilight zone. That's where I'm not doing any work and I'm defining my Shabbos. At that point, I'm allowed to still take the bread off the tree because it's a rabbinic prohibition that doesn't apply yet. Amar Lahu Rav Nachman Yasher. Rav Nachman said, "Oh, that's a nice explanation." Shmuel also said that. Amrulei Patrisu Bakula Hai. Is that how far you're taking the interpretation of this Mishnah? Inunami Akapasiba. You're also taking it that far. Is this an established halacha that you're establishing in halacha? Amalu in indeed, this is the case that we're talking about, and we're accepting that as the halacha. Itmanami, indeed, it was said like this. Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel, it is a tree that's in a public domain. It is 10 tefachim high and 4 tefachim wide, which defines it as a private domain. And he's intending to be below, and he can access the tree. At above 10 tefachim, it's going to be invalid because the eruv is outside of his domain, in the two separate domains. Below 10 tefachim is going to be valid because they're both within the Rishus HaRabim, the public domain. However, we have another problem. He can't access it because it's on a tree, to which we say, and it's the opinion of Rebbe that since at the onset of Shabbos, he can still reach it, he can still touch it because during twilight, during Bein HaShmoshes, the rabbinic prohibitions don't apply. And the mitzvah and the definition of Kona Shvisa, where you're defining your Shabbos space, starts at that moment. And so therefore, at the moment of Kona Shvisa, at the moment that Eruv sets in, he's still able to move and access that bread.